Good morning, reading room. We are here to continue our reading of Being Catholic Now. I need to go turn off that heater. It is so beautiful outside, but if you ever noticed here in Michigan, our homes stay cool. So we have this battle of, do we turn the heat on? When do we turn it on? How do we, when do we turn it off for good now in spring? Whatever. I have my glasses, heater, and the book. I'll be right back. We brought back our philosophical classroom. That is day 78 in our philosophical classroom. We are here in day 186 in our regular classroom. Early Birds book list has been here since the beginning, and reading room, the three studies, the triune, not sacred. Don't get your panties in a bunch, Catholics. Being Catholic Now by Kerry Kennedy. Do I love this? The answer is I do. I do love this. Even though I breezed through that one, guys. Oh. Okay, we are here with Lori Brink, comma, OP. Sister Lori Brink, born February 22nd, 1961, a Dominican sister of Sinsinawa. Boy, that doesn't sound like a very good place for a nun to come from unless you're looking for clients. Sinsinawa is an assistant professor of biblical studies at Catholic Theological Union, where she teaches courses on biblical studies. Prior to her entrance into the Dominican, she served as a lay volunteer in Jamaica, where she taught in a girls' high school, worked with victims of Hansen's disease, leprosy, and volunteered at an orphanage run by the Sisters of Mercy. That's nice. I'm the daughter of a retired Navy man, so we traveled most of my life, and that certainly affected and formed how I understand myself as a person, as a minister, and very much as a Catholic. My mother is a convert, and that is important because there are a lot of little things about being Catholic that I was never taught because she was never taught. For instance, we had this little statue of the bust of the Blessed Mother sitting over this little tub. I had no idea it was the holy water font because my mother had it on the wall about eye level to her. She had no idea that water went in it. It was like a decorative piece, and I used to be fascinated by Mary and the tub. I never knew little things like that. My earliest memory is of Morocco because my father was stationed there. I often have a sense of being more comfortable in the Arab world than anywhere else. Being Catholic has always been a part of my identity that wasn't shared with the people around me. Because we moved frequently, we were never really in Catholic circles. In the military, you're segregated according to rank. You aren't distinguished by race or religion. You're either an enlisted man or woman or an officer. My dad was an enlisted man. When we lived in San Francisco, my brother and I played this game to see which one of us could see the CCD, catechism class, bus coming through the fog first. Through the murkiness, we could see We could just make out the headlights. So early on, church was very mysterious, and being Catholic meant getting on this spooky bus that came out of the fog and took us some other place in the fog. We had fog too. I mean, it was just fog. I mean, we used to watch the bus come out of the fog, but that was usually in the winter time. It was interesting though. It was like a cool scene, cool looking scene. After CCD, we got to go to the base movie theater. Movies were about 10 cents. It was kind of like Crayons for Christ. It was a very positive, a cool kind of Saturday thing to do. I always had this extremely positive sense of church, though my parents weren't terribly religious. They were good folks, and they went to church on Sundays, but the larger issues were never of interest to them. Because my dad was in the Navy, we often worshiped on base. We were never really part of a parish, never did have roots in the structure. Churches on the bases were multifunctional and multi-denominational. I remember on this one base, when the Catholics would have Mass, the altar area rotated. One side was the Protestant backdrop, and one side was the tabernacle and the Catholic backdrop. There was this kind of switch somewhere. It was functional and it was mysterious. It was something that made you different. When something would be happening and I could do it, or if somebody else was doing something different, my parents would say, "We're Catholic." I never quite knew what that meant. When I was growing up in Knoxville, Catholics were only 1% of the population, and not all the people liked us. The first year we lived there, my mother was in the church choir, and they came over for our Christmas party. I looked outside the window, and there was a cross burning on our lawn. This was 1976. I was probably 14 or 15. I was the first one to see it, and I was the first one to run out of the house. I remember being absolutely enraged by this, and my father pulling me away because I was so angry. I couldn't believe you could be singled out for being Catholic in such a negative way. I was adopted through Catholic Family Services. Being Catholic was my link to my biological mother, who was Catholic. This connection to the past made me determined to stay Catholic, and I became celibate, not that one leads to the other. The cross was kind of a visual symbol for what was probably always a part of my personality. I wasn't so much social justice. Things were either right or wrong. I was very dramatic about things, and if there was a cause, I'd be the first one to run up the hill with the flag. When things aren't right, someone has to say something, and I have absolutely no problem being the first one to say it and be shocked. I've developed a little discretion as I've aged. When I was 19, I went to Jamaica and fell madly in love with the Jamaicans. I had what could probably be called a conversion experience of sorts. Not a conversion of my faith deepened, but I was turned inside out as an American. I went down there thinking much of myself. I was the award-winning journalist who was really going to do something for the poor, and in reality, everything was done to me. It was the experience of seeing dire poverty and at the same time, the joy of people in these dire situations. I think, how can you be happy? This is a hovel. You're hungry. You've nothing to wear, and they'd offer me something to eat or to drink. There was no way I could go back to being a reporter. I'd lost my edge. I'd met the face of genuine, and it was absolutely stunning. That really was the pivot for me with regard to my commitment and love of the church and my commitment to the poor and forgotten. One of my ministries was to visit this home for people with Hansen's disease, which is leprosy. Now I may be 21 and I hadn't seen anybody with leprosy. I didn't even know leprosy still existed. I would visit with these folks and just kind of chat with them. These are people who had no ears, no nose, were blind, had no fingers, couldn't walk, I would sit with this woman whose name was Ms. Lillian. She had no fingers left, and she would say, I want you to write a letter to my family. They lived somewhere up in the mountains. What do you want me to write? And she would say, Dear whoever it was, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And I said, Ms. Lillian, this is the Our Father. She said, yes. You want me to write the Our Father? She said, yes. Don't they know the Our Father? I asked. And she said, yes, that is what I want you to write because it says everything. Then she took my face and what was left of her hands, which were just nubs, and she was blind, and she held me, and she said again, it is everything. I was supposed to be in Jamaica for 6 months, and I stayed for 2 years because I couldn't stand to leave. I loved who I was becoming while I was there. I had a honeymoon in Jamaica. At that time, the classrooms were streamed, so the least functioning students were all in one class, and that was mine. I'd worked with one of them, Olive was her name, extensively the first semester because she tended to steal people's lunches. She was hungry, and she had a terrible lisp, so I'd meet with her after class. We worked together, and she was not terribly attractive and obviously uncared for. I could say that about a lot of them, but they were my girls. We got one piece of chalk a week, and they didn't have textbooks. When we came back from Christmas break, there was no Olive for a month. Finally, Olive came back, and I told her I needed to have a note from her mother about where she'd been. So she wrote a note and passed it to another girl, and I took the note. It was addressed to me because she wanted to tell me something and didn't know how. It said, please, miss, I'm pregnant. My brother and his friends gang raped me. I have venereal disease. Please, can you give me money for an abortion? Now, I was all of 22, so I called her out of class and asked if all that was true, and she said yes. We went to the counselor, who was a Blavet Dominican, Kathy Howard, and Kathy met with her. And because she had venereal disease and hadn't been treated, we had to talk to the principal, whose decision was that she needed to leave campus and come back to school with her mother. This was a developing country. This girl wasn't coming back. Her only lifeline was this school, and she'd asked me for help. Her mother said it was her fault for not sleeping with her jeans on. I knew the mother wouldn't show up. This was the moment at which, if I'd had any hope in the goodness of institutions, I lost it. I believed we were doing good things in this school, and this was a lifetime for many of these children. And this was a lifeline for many of these children. I was part of it, and now I was part of another side because I had to walk her off campus, this person who'd confided in me. What Olive needed was God, and I never taught Olive about God. I never told her that God loved her no matter what. I said to myself from that moment that I'd only speak of God and to God, which is what Saint Dominic did. How about just tell people what you just said? Seems like that would make more sense. I don't know. I watched her get on the bus and never saw her again. I realized as the person who was going on to the next great American novelist that I didn't need to write anything. It had already been written. It was the gospel. My job now was to proclaim. I was committing myself to a path because of that experience for the sake of Olive and every single Olive I meet every single day in all the places I am. I came back from that experience, looked into Dominicans in New York, and eventually made profession with the Sinsinawa Dominicans. For me, being Catholic isn't so much about social justice, though it's part of my story. It's about the mystery of the faith. Because I teach the Bible, it's about the sense of history that our church is much older, much bigger, much broader than the perspective we bring to it. Because I study history, I can see that it changes. It doesn't change as quickly as sometimes I think it should or I'd like it to, but it does change. The people of God are confused. They're becoming polarized because they're trying to figure out who we are and what it means to be Catholic. Some of us, in asking the questions, are more like evangelicals, and some of us are more like socialists. That diversity in the church isn't new. We weren't always sure of the parameters anymore. When people don't know their boundaries, they can get very anxious about setting them and saying who is in and who is out. Rather than saying that one is a Baptist or a Catholic, we're now saying that one is a good Catholic or a bad Catholic. The hierarchy is in crisis, and it has to realize that it simply doesn't have the people power to make sure that our central sacrament continues and is available. It knows that things have to change or the Eucharist will be diminished, and when that happens, how will we be Catholics? Because I teach at the Catholic seminary, I am bound to not advocate. I don't think that, see, that's just way too much emphasis on the Eucharist. Seriously? Seriously? That's why you're Catholic? I think being Catholic means serving the poor. But Eucharist does look like it's good character, doesn't it? Because I teach at the Catholic seminary, I am bound to not advocate women's ordination and not even talk about it. We are not allowed to talk about some things. This one is a formal no-no. But I trust the Spirit to open the hearts and minds of the hierarchy. She can be very persuasive. I didn't experience the enthusiasm of Vatican II, and I had no sense of what the church was like before, so I'm not disappointed that Vatican II hasn't done everything its proponents thought it'd do. I'm just trying to figure out what it means to be Catholic. When I get a handle on that, then maybe I'll have some righteous anger on what was promised and what wasn't delivered. This is part of the discrepancy with the younger folk in the church. We were so poorly catechized, good enough, that our issues are, first, ones of identity and spirituality, and second, of theology. Then what about the Eucharist you just said? I was born in 1961, and I'm at the very beginning of Generation X. There is a distinction between those generations that I'm coming to see more and more. For my generation, everything has always been in flux. There is no institution that has gone unscathed for us. We were the ones who were children during Watergate. Everything after that simply confirmed that you can't trust any institution, so we don't. I'm never disappointed that the church hierarchy does something screwy. I wouldn't know what to do with an institution that lived up to some higher standards. A lot of Generation X folks have problems with trusting. I think Generation X is my first year, which is 65. This is all familiar to me, including that 1961 mistake. Whatever. If I were Pope, first I'd work on the outfits. Joking. I'd initiate a revival. I want us to remember what it was that lit our hearts on fire to begin with. Why we bother calling ourselves the church. I'd want a year of prayer and fasting for us and for the world, for the sins we committed, asking for forgiveness from those we've wronged, and making reparation as a church. I'd want a recognition of who we are before God. That is the fear of God. Philosophical classroom, right there. I'd want a recognition of who we are before God. Me too. It's introspection, folks, not judgment day. That we're instruments, creatures of God. We're not God. God, in God's magnitude, decided to make us in God's image. And we darn well better start living up to that image. God, in God's magnitude, decided to make us in God's image. Wow. Yeah. And if that is the truth, then when you think about that kind of magnitude of God, to be able to make a plan and devise it in a way that will bring his children back to him. And that's what the philosophical classroom is about. It is about what I believe to see it to be a sequence of events to bring God's children back to him. I've said it before, and it's on the smallest scale to the largest scale, right, of human integrity. God, in God's magnitude, decided to make us in God's image, and we darn well better start living up to that image. If I didn't believe so strongly in the Jesus story, I'd be Jewish in a heartbeat. The Jesus story is originally the Jewish story and the narrative of Israel and its struggle with coming to understanding who it was before God. It's a magnificent story, and Jesus understood that story and articulated it in a new way for a new time. Exactly. With all the same stability of the basic principles. Well said, Sister Lori Brink, OP. Well said. Yeah, a couple phrases there that I definitely have to mark. And I have to get my my tablet and my pen, which I took into the bedroom. Used to have a rule to not do that, but I had a really hard time sleeping last night. And I was exhausted this morning. So, let me see how long Ingrid's is. It's not that long. But we're at 12:22. We got on at 12 o'clock. That's 22 minutes. We'll do 2 tomorrow because the first one will be short. The first one will be from Ingrid Matson. Ingrid Matson. And there is a photo of her if you want to check her out on the internet before we read about what she has to say about being Catholic now. There was in this story one convert. Maybe she's the convert, right? I've heard the story of another convert, Abdul. I don't remember, but he's been around here a lot. This area, which is amazing because he's really known in religious, the non-denominational circles, and they pay a lot of money for him to speak. And so I've seen him speak a few times because he comes to the local church. And he was converted to Christianity, which I think is a pretty big conversion. It's a very interesting conversion, and it's a pretty big conversion. So we are reading stories of conversion. We are reading stories of non-conversion. We are reading stories of conversions of the mind, but not of the religious doctrine or whatever however you want to call it. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have just intellectually completed day number 186, and that didn't make any sense either. Day number 186 in the classroom. It is April 29th. 30 days has September, so we will be back here for April 30th and then again May 1st for our 3 days on. Hope you enjoyed your 4 days off of the classroom. I just think that this is really just a dose of good education. Thanks for joining me here. And I will see you. I'll see you tomorrow.